So this is the video lesson on a new paradigm for learning. And the new paradigm for learning is called the mutually adaptive learning paradigm, or MALP. And you see the little circle R, so MALP is a registered trademark. I developed it in Wisconsin back in the early 90s. And I'm still talking about it today because I think that it's sorely needed. It's a culturally responsive and sustaining instructional model. That's why it's part of our training. So let's go. Now, I'm going to have you pick up where we left off. Where did we leave off? Cultural dissonance. Do you remember the three cultural differences, underlying differences that we looked at? See if you can remember the three. Think. Now, I'm going to show you something. Does that help? If you missed any, you can think again. Notice retrieval may be assisted by a visual. We're doing retrieval practice. All right, here they are. Remember now? There we go. All right. So we are going to be taking these three differences and mapping them onto learning paradigms. And then take a look at the paradigms that result. And following that, we'll take a look at MALP. So let's first ask this question. How do we reduce cultural dissonance while fostering learning in this new setting? How do we do that? That's the answer that MALP provides. The how. But I'll give you a minute to think about ideas you may have that might answer that question. What do you think we should be considering? What are the factors that might help reduce dissonance but foster learning? It may be something we've talked about in the course, some theoretical background that you have. Just think about that. Okay? So now, if we're going to look at MALP, what is it? Is the mutually adaptive learning paradigm. So we see the word paradigm there. Now think about paradigm. It probably means there's going to be a shift. And do you recall the quote from Darwin? Those who survive will not necessarily be the strongest or the most intelligent, but the ones who can adapt and adjust to change. So when we talk about this paradigm being mutually adaptive, we're talking about a paradigm shift. But who's shifting? Everybody's shifting. We meet in the middle. And that way, instead of having one group go all the way to the other paradigm or other way to the new paradigm, we ask both. So how does that happen? Let's see. First, we're going to look at what we're really doing here. We're providing culturally responsive instruction that takes elements from the student's learning paradigm and elements from Western-style education, and we make a transitional model to address the achievement gap through focusing on cultural dissonance. What does that remind you of? The theory that we've been talking about. What do you notice here? as you look about these elements from both. What does it remind you of? Did you say schema theory? Balancing the schemata? Yeah, that's what we're doing. And you'll see how that happens in this model. Now we're going to look at two different learning paradigms. The items at the bottom of this slide all go somewhere on the slide. We'll get to that in a minute. First, I want to talk to you about the way this slide is set up. So I think of learning in terms of three aspects: conditions, processes, and activities. So what do we mean by that? The conditions have to do with what you need in order to learn. And everyone has different conditions. Many of them are cultural, not just individual. So perhaps you have to know someone in order to learn from them. Now, that's not the case with us. Some of you didn't know me at all, and I think you've been learning, I hope. But do you remember my student Ty, who came to me and said, after talking with me that time after class, now I know you. I can learn from you. Okay, so that was a condition for him. It's an example. The second are processes. How do you expect to interact with new material and access it? Now remember, when we did the intercultural communication framework, and it was presented in two different ways, two styles. One was the visuals and the oral and the stories I told you, and the other was the handout, one slide. Different processes for learning. And the last are activities. Activities have to do with what it is you are expecting the teacher to ask you to do in order to build and demonstrate mastery of whatever is being taught. So, for example, in the sessions that we are having, we do a sign-in activity, we do whole group applications, we do breakout group and share, previewing, we do reflections. We have a set of activities that we go through, that we cycle through. Right? So those are the learning activities. So those are the three components, aspects of learning. Now we have two paradigms here: the familiar cultural settings, which for our purposes don't have to be SLIFE. It can be anyone along the continuum who is struggling and not reaching their potential and needs culturally responsive teaching, that layer in the layers of the instructional context. And then we have the US classroom settings. And so I'd like you to take a minute to do the left-hand side, the familiar cultural settings, and check the items that fit with that side. Let's see if you get them. And we'll look at that in a minute. All right, let's see. Let's see how you did. So now we'll take a look at the first one. Conditions, immediate relevance, right? It has to be something they can relate to in the present time. And our system, it's all about the future. Prepare for the test, college and career readiness, all of that. It's all about the future. Goal setting. We think we have to get them involved in school, so make them set goals. But they want now. What can I use now? Next, interconnectedness. You remember the web? Okay, that's what they want. They want to feel connected with each other and with you. And what is our system based on? Independence. Separation of people and knowledge as you go from kindergarten to the doctorate. The height is to be able to study and not need any professor, just study on your own and do your dissertation. Whereas when in kindergarten, they're hugging your leg, right? Okay. Those are the conditions. Look how different they are. Now let's look at the processes. Sharing of responsibility, right? Working together toward a goal. Yes, that's what they prefer. That's their orientation. Then we have the next item, which is individual accountability. So our system is designed for people to be individually accountable. Even if we do group work, everyone has a job to do, and we usually do it for low stakes and individual accountability when it's high stakes. That's our normal way of operating. The other process is the oral transmission versus the written word. And even though we do a lot of speaking and listening in class, obviously, when it comes down to when it really counts, it's usually the written word. It's usually literacy based. And finally, the pragmatic tasks based on sociocultural experiences, right? Doing something that's going to really serve a purpose, a function in the community in which you live. Whereas for us, what is it all about? And you remember the tasks that we did last time, all those different tasks, defining, true, false, categorization. Yeah. So these are the two. We have these two paradigms. Now, my question to you is, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? They're so different. Think about that. What's the solution? I want you to put a pin in that and be thinking about it while I continue with a couple of other ideas about this slide, and then maybe you'll have an idea. So, what I'd like you to do now is see if you can find on this slide where the three cultural differences are represented. So let's take the first one that we looked at, which is orality versus literacy. Where do you see that? Where do you see that on this slide? That cultural difference. Okay, where do you see the collectivism versus individualism? Where do you see that on the slide? It might be in more than one place because there are only 3 differences and 5 items on each side. And where do you see evidence of the difference between informal learning and formal education? Again, it might be in more than one place. Okay. And so we see that we have oral transmission versus the written word. That's our orality versus literacy. The collectivism, individualism is interconnectedness and shared responsibility versus independence and individual accountability. And we'll talk later about the paradigm and what the difference is between those two, the conditions and processes, because that's a technical point having to do with analyzing lessons when we get to that. And then what about informal versus formal? So informal learning would be immediate relevance and pragmatic tasks based on sociocultural experiences versus future relevance and decontextualized tasks based on academic ways of thinking. How did you do? Okay. Now I want to show you one more thing. Let's see if you can look at this and see what you see. So this is the same 2 paradigms. I just want you to look at this. So if you see this combination of individual accountability, written word, and the decontextualized task based on academic ways of thinking, I want you to look at that for a minute and see if you can identify what it is. What is it? Does it remind you of anything? What do we do in school that involves these 3 elements? See if you get it. All right. And here it is. It's standardized testing. It is, isn't it? So think about this. And this is where I am just doing a tiny segue to the final piece of the training, which has to do with advocacy. But I just want to give you a hint of what's ahead for that. So when students don't do well on standardized tests, we call it an achievement gap. I believe in reframing the conversation and not calling it that, because what I think it is evidence of cultural dissonance, as demonstrated by the two paradigms which are culturally based, and the student is coming from a different learning paradigm. And you could see that in the example of the tools and the log, among other things. So in that situation, we can see that perhaps the reason they're having difficulty is not so much ability and achievement per se, but that layer that they need, that extra layer. And we're going to take a look at how MALP addresses that. Now, I'd like now to show you the paradigm, but before I do, before I show you the paradigm, I'd like to try something, please, and explain to you. I want to show you the cartoon first. Hang on. Remember this cartoon? Right. So what I'd like you to do now that's the last slide. You want to learn MALP, right? Consider no more slides, no handouts in the Google shared folder that give you the model, no readings and perusal that give you the model. Okay, nothing. Imagine you have nothing except just me. No notes, no recordings, no slides, no nothing. Just me talking. Now, we're not doing this in person. When I do the training in person, I walk around the room and I tell people, put your pen down, put your device down. This is it. No more slides, just me talking about the model. And then I ask people how they feel. So I'm going to ask you, hypothetically, how do you feel? And now I'll ask you, what are you going to do about it? What strategies will you use? Let's say you have to do this. What will you do in order to learn this new model that you want to use in your classroom and just have me talking to you about it? What will your strategies be? Now, I want you to remember your answers to those two questions when we do get to the model MALP. But of course, that was a hypothetical. And we know that you have a chapter in Perusal, you have documents in your Google folder, and we have more slides. It was an experiment, and I think if you have it on your back burner and I bring it up in a few more minutes here, that will mean something to you. So now we're going to look at MALP. These are, and it says life in this case, these are the three components of MALP. So what do we do when we have MALP? Well, what we're going to do is take elements from each side, but we have to think what to take, what makes sense. Now, remember, the intercultural communication framework is still our underlying theory of everything, right? So we have to consider relationships, very important. We have to consider priorities, ours and theirs. And we have to consider moving from familiar to unfamiliar schemata. So that's underlying MALP. So see if you can see those three principles underlying what I'm going to show you. Our first component of MALP, two elements. We're going to accept the conditions for learning. So if the students need it to be immediately relevant and need interconnectedness, we are going to focus there, and we're going to try to make the learning both immediately relevant and building that web of relationships. Think about the class surveys that we looked at. The class surveys did that. That's why that is a MALP project. So rather than focus on making them independent, which is not their priority, or making them think about their future, which is also not their priority, let's us adapt in that direction. Okay, so we're going in their direction toward their priorities and also building relationships, because interconnectedness does that, right? Now, the second component is we're going to combine the processes. So we're going to get them so they can go back and forth and back and forth. We know that on the right side, they have to do that. It's a priority of ours for literacy and for testing. We know they need to get over to the right, but we need to get it going back and forth for both low stakes and high stakes, so you don't just bait and switch like we saw before with the testing drum. You don't want them to just have their oral transmission and comfort level with shared responsibility and then suddenly throw them individual accountability in the written word. We don't want to do that. So we're going to be going back and forth for low stakes and for high stakes. Okay. And the third item is now our priority and balancing the schemata. We have familiar schemata. On the left, we have some. So now we need some unfamiliar, which is balancing it. We're going to make explicit the instruction on decontextualized tasks and academic ways of thinking. And all MALP projects do that. The class surveys clearly did that. So we're focusing on that. That's a big part of what we're teaching them. So instead of always teaching new language and content, we're going to have that third leg of the stool, like 3, right? It's a formal schemata that they need more than anything. And so we're going to be working with them on that. But look over to the left side, and what do you notice here? Focus on new activities with familiar language and content. So when we're teaching them a new decontextualized task, true, false, or which they have to learn, or we're teaching them a new academic way of thinking, such as cause and effect, which they have to learn, we're going to be doing it with content and language that isn't problematic for them. Whether it's their native language, bilingual education works perfectly here, or if it's English that they've already mastered, so they're not taxing themselves linguistically, because they're focusing on these new ways of thinking. They're focusing on the formal schemata. Right? And this is what MALP does. So in other words, rather than teaching the way they learn, because you could say, oh, why don't we just teach the way they learn? Well, because they have to get over to the right-hand side in order to do what is known as, graduate. Okay? And if we do it only on our side and we say, well, they're here now, they should learn our system, well, we're doing that and it isn't working. So the mutually adaptive learning paradigm says, okay, let's blend. We'll blend. We'll both shift. So as Darwin was pointing out, if we can all adapt to change, that's how we're all going to survive. All right? This will work. It has worked. It does work. So this is what we're going to be looking at, and you will be reading about it in Perusal. And in the next video lesson, I'm going to show you our project, another project, that we can look at and illustrate with examples from the classroom. And the last piece I want to show you is called the MALP Teacher Planning Checklist. So we have something very practical that you can use to apply MALP. And there is a filled-in checklist in the chapter that you're reading, A New Paradigm for Learning. There is a filled-in checklist in the student project that is uploaded to Peruzal also. So you have two examples of filled-in checklists. And I just want to show you that the checklist itself is introduced in this book, which is an older book, 2011, almost 10 years now. But this is where we introduce the checklist, and we have two teachers, a social studies teacher and a math teacher, and we go through their lessons in great detail, and we fill out the checklist. And the actual blank checklist is right here, and it's on page 68 in the book, and you can Xerox it, freely Xerox it and use it. You have permission to use the checklist, right? All right, so that winds up this lesson, and I hope you enjoyed learning about MALP. Thank you.